My name is Andrew Edmondson, and I'm a physician scientist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Today I'm going to talk about understanding clinical trial design for CDG therapies. So 2 years ago at this conference, I discussed CDG models and how those are used to generate ideas and identify novel drugs. We've seen some really exciting things over the last couple of years, including work by Prolara to do drug screening in a C. elegans model of PMM2 CDG that's identified apalrostat as a potential new therapy. And initial data out of the Chow lab using flies and NGLY1 deficiency has identified some really interesting targets. And more recent work has also identified some very interesting new therapeutics that could be repurposed. So I'm sure if there's any NGLY1 families out there, Dr. Chow would love to talk to you about how to prioritize some of these agents. But how do we take these ideas, these drugs, and move them into clinical trials, and how do we get a new therapy for CDG out at the back end? So there's an entire path for how things move through these things, and they start with the idea, but then that idea needs to go under further development, refinement, getting new knowledge, and preclinical studies. Studies that look at how these agents work in animals and give us some sense of how they may work in humans. All of this data then undergoes a regulatory review to determine if it's likely safe to try these therapies in a patient. That moves into a clinical trial where we gather information about the safety and efficacy in patients, after which the data is reviewed to determine if it looks like these agents are safe and effective. If they determine that, then they are given FDA approval and released to the market, after which there's additional post-market surveillance to determine if these agents are efficacious and are they safe. This process of gaining information about how a drug responds and how safe it is in a human subject is known as a clinical trial. Clinical trials are divided into several phases. Each phase is designed with a particular purpose in mind and is designed in a stepwise fashion to initially use a small number of patients to determine how safe the new drug is, and then with increasing numbers of patients to look at additional questions and gather additional data about the dosing that's required, about efficacy, and then once approved, to monitor its safety and efficacy in actual clinical practice. So we're going to hone in on each of these phases and discuss them in a little bit more detail. So a clinical trial phase 1 study's primary purpose is really to evaluate safety and a bit the dosage of a new drug. If this is a new drug that's never been in humans before, it's initially generally tried in healthy volunteers. And these are known as first-in-human studies. If it's the first time that a drug has ever been used in a patient, it's often known as an N-of-1 study. These are typically open-label studies where the patient and the investigator, everyone knows that the individual is receiving the study medication. And the main purpose of this phase of a clinical trial is to evaluate safety. If it's determined from this trial that it's likely safe, it then moves into a phase 2 clinical trial. So the primary purpose of a phase 2 trial is to look at the efficacy, but also to evaluate the side effects in a larger number of individuals. Phase 2 trial is the first time it's administered to patients with the condition for which the drug is being developed. And so additional safeguards need to be in place to make sure that it doesn't react and have different health effects in individuals who have an underlying disease condition. Often, these phase 2 trials include groups of patients who receive a placebo, which is a substance that really has no therapeutic value. And when studying a placebo, there's often incorporated blinding where individuals in the trial and investigators don't know who is getting the actual new therapeutic and who's getting the placebo. And this really allows for correct determination of the side effects and potentially the efficacy of this new drug. If things look promising in a phase 2 clinical trial, it moves into a phase 3 clinical trial. So a phase 3 clinical trial's primary purpose is to determine the efficacy of that agent, as well as for the monitoring of any adverse reactions in a larger number of individuals. These are designed primarily to determine if there is a treatment benefit to this new medication. And these are often known as efficacy trials or pivotal trials. Almost universally, these trials contain a placebo and have blinding of both the patients and the investigators. And then, as I mentioned, there's phase 4 studies that are after approval when the medication is being prescribed by doctors. That is post-approval monitoring to ensure that it actually is safe and actually efficacious in the broader population. But these studies have no placebo and there's no blinding. The Frontiers in CDG Consortium has put together a short video to further explore some of these points that I'd like to show you now.
CDG investigators around the world work tirelessly to find treatments for CDG and NGLY1 CDG. We want to understand the reasons behind the health problems that affect these individuals and then to find new and better ways to improve the symptoms or to treat the underlying disease itself. That process of finding new treatments is called a clinical trial. Participants in a clinical trial are really CDG pioneers who lead the way for the entire CDG and NGLY1 communities. First, before a clinical trial can even start, we need to be sure that untested treatments will be safe for medically complex patients. And that starts with scientific and medical investigators working through large piles of important governmental regulations. The very first trials in patients are often safety trials and sometimes involve testing a treatment on a single patient. It's called an N of 1, or in a small group of patients as open label studies, which means that everyone knows the patient is getting the new treatment. These studies check for safety, but investigators will also look for evidence that the treatment is improving health. But that is not the main purpose of these studies. To determine whether a new treatment is actually helpful requires a larger study known as an efficacy trial. Of course, everyone, the investigators, patients, families, all hope that this new treatment will work. But this hope can lead everyone involved in the study to see signs that the treatment is really working, but maybe ignore evidence that it's not working. To avoid this bias, investigators use randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. Now, what does that mean? Well, in these types of trials, everyone is unaware of who receives the new treatment to keep everyone honest about whether the new treatment actually helps the patient or not. Participants are randomly assigned to either get the new treatment or a placebo. That's an inactive substance that looks like the drug or the treatment being tested, but it's designed to have no therapeutic value. How do we know if the new treatment worked? Well, we know because the placebo group did not improve. Trial participants who receive the placebo are critical to determine the true value of the new treatment. Now, the investigators will seek to make the new treatment available to everyone as soon as possible. So those patients, those who receive the placebo, may be first in line to start the new treatment even before it is available to the broader community. That's an incentive for patients to participate in the clinical trials. Even if the participant knows they may get the placebo in the trial, they will get first access to the treatment quicker than patients who do not participate. The FCDGC is working on starting several clinical trials as we seek to find new treatments for CDG and NGLY1 patients. The details of each study may differ as investigators seek the clearest answers while minimizing burden and maximizing the benefit for participants enrolled in the trials. It's a very personal decision whether to participate in a clinical trial or not. If you're potentially interested, we encourage you to contact our clinical trial sites to determine if you're eligible and to get more information on what the trial will involve so that you can make an informed decision. There's no cost for the research treatments, and some reimbursement for travel may be available. Simply discussing the enrollment is not a commitment, and you always have the right to stop participating if you don't want to continue. Being enrolled in a clinical trial does not replace your typical medical care, and you should continue to see your regular doctors while you're enrolled in a clinical trial. You can see what trials are currently available at clinicaltrials.gov and at the FCDGC website at www.raredisesesnetwork.org/FCDGC/studies.
So what are these upcoming clinical trials that the video refers to? I'd like to go over a timeline of what you can expect in the coming months and years for CDG clinical trials. You may be aware of a currently available clinical trial using acetazolamide in PMN2 CDG. This is a phase 2 clinical trial, so primarily focusing on safety and efficacy of acetazolamide in a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial in individuals with PMN2 CDG who are more than 4 years old and have ataxia. Here's a timeline of the study where at the beginning, patients are randomized to receive acetazolamide or placebo. And then there's several lab checks and dose adjustment of the study medication to try and ensure the safety. And then after 6 months on the study, there's an efficacy measurement, after which patients are allowed an open label extension where they can go on acetazolamide and know they're on it if they would like to. This study is currently open and enrolling, although there's only a few spots left. So we're hoping to close out enrollment very soon. And if you're interested, please talk with us. We're also working on a number of upcoming future clinical trials. The details of these are still under some of that regulatory review that I referred to, so details may change, but I'd like to share with you what we're currently planning. These clinical trials will be offered as the acetazolamide clinical trial is at the 3 clinical trial sites of the Frontiers in CDG Consortium at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, at Mayo Clinic, and at Seattle Children's in Washington. So the first study is in partnership with Avalo Therapeutics to investigate AVTX-801, which is essentially a pharmaceutical grade galactose. So you may be aware that galactose is widely used in PGM1 CDG, almost becoming standard of care in the treatment of these patients, despite not having gone through clinical trials. This was largely from observations in more open label N of 1 type studies. But in an effort to gather further information on the efficacy of galactose in PGM1 CDG, as well as to try and gather sufficient evidence to encourage insurance companies to cover galactose in the treatment of this condition. We're conducting a phase 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial in PGM1 CDG. Here, individuals will be randomized to receive pharmaceutical grade galactose, AVTX-801, or the placebo, and will be very carefully monitored for the safety aspect of the trial. And then after 16 weeks on the study, there will be efficacy measurements and then open label extension where everyone can go on to AVTX-801 if they would like to. We're also planning a clinical trial of galactose in SLC35A2 CDG. So we've performed phase 1 open label studies that suggested that galactose may have some efficacy in the condition and is safe And so we're now planning a phase 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. So individuals with SLC35A2 CDG can be randomized to either go on escalating doses of galactose or placebo. And after 6 total months of therapy, we'll then have an efficacy assessment and then be given the option to go on open label galactose. We are also planning a study, and this is based on some of the work I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation out of Clement Chow's lab, using fly screening in NGLY1 deficiency, which identified that N-acetylglucosamine may be useful. And phase 1 open label N of 1 studies have also suggested that this is safe and may be beneficial for individuals with NGLY1 CDDG. And so we're planning a phase 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial in NGLY1 that primarily will be assessing the effect of this supplement on tear production, which for those of you who may not be familiar, individuals with NGLY1 have very, very dry eyes, and this can lead to a lot of eye problems and cornea defects. And so increased tear production may be very helpful for them. And this was one of the primary effects that individuals on open label N-acetylglucosamine reported having improvement in. So this will be a short study where individuals will be randomized to either N-acetylglucosamine or placebo and have 6 weeks on their therapy and then determine the effect on tear production. So these are the studies that are coming out of the Frontiers in CDG Consortium over the next several months. I'm sure everyone has been excited to hear about the successes, and I also mentioned these at the beginning of my presentation with Pilar and Maggie's Pearl and NIH funding to look at the effect of apalrostat, which was identified through drug screening efforts for PMM2 CDG. So this will be a phase 3 clinical trial. So an efficacy trial, a pivotal study as a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial to assess clinical improvement with apalrostat. And the plan for this study is that 40 patients with PMM2 CDG will be enrolled and randomized to either receive apalrostat or placebo treatment. And then after several months on therapy, we'll have efficacy measurements and then be allowed to go on open label apalrostat. There's also exciting clinical trials on the horizon from Glycomine. And so we've been hearing a lot from Glycomine over the last several years. And so it's very exciting to hear that their studies are getting close to clinical trials. And they have, in fact, already initiated a phase 1 clinical trial for their product NGLY1, which is a sort of first in human study as a new therapy and is being performed in healthy volunteers. If everything looks safe there, the plans are then to move to phase 2 trials with adult PMM2 CDG patients in the US and in Europe receiving NGLY1 and a pediatric PMM2 CDG trial that will be solely performed in Europe. If things look safe and there's evidence of potential efficacy in these phase 2 trials, then their plan is to move forward with a phase 3 pivotal study of NGLY1 in pediatric PMM2 patients that will likely be done in both the US, Europe, and UK. So as you can see, a lot of exciting things on the horizon with acetazolamide for PMM2 CDG being available now, but with multiple agents being available in the near future and coming months. And then there are others that I don't have time to go into that will be coming later, as well as who knows what the future holds. But one of the questions I often get from patients and families who come to see me is, what about the other CDG types, and how can you get interest and therapies for your CDG type? And so what I think is a great opportunity right now that I also want to include is the CDG natural history study. So this is going back to that overarching view of how to get a drug treatment into approval, is working on those early phases, developing the ideas, furthering that development and preclinical studies. And so by your enrollment in the natural history study, you'll be contributing data that will help give us those ideas, that will give us the baseline measurements we need for understanding how to design clinical trials. And your presence will indicate the desire and willingness of your CDG type to participate in clinical trials, which will give us further motivation to develop those ideas and do these, start developing these clinical trials. So the natural history study sites, we've been working to develop a lot of those around the country, trying to make it more convenient for you to participate so that you don't have to travel as far of distance. And so we have 13 sites currently in the United States, as well as 3 sites in Europe to gather this natural history information. So I would encourage you to reach out and join the natural history efforts. With that, I want to acknowledge the Frontiers in CDG Consortium and its funding sources, as well as all the patient advocacy groups who also contribute to our efforts as we work to develop treatments and cures for CDG types. And with that, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. And this QR code will take you to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia CDG clinic site, where you can also submit questions, and be happy to hear from you. Thanks.